If you're doing a DIY renovation of a house in Japan, it's really helpful to have an electrician's license. That means you can do all the electrical work yourself. It's actually pretty easy to get one. I'll tell you about what prerequisites there are, what the benefits are, how much it costs, how long it takes, all that sort of stuff. So enjoy the show. There are two types of electrician's licenses, Class 1 and Class 2. I'm just about Class 2, which is the easier one to get. And I might use the word denki kojishi from now on because that's what an electrician is in Japan. So from now on, if you hear denki kojishi, it means electrician. So in order to become licensed as an electrician in Japan, you need to pass two tests. There's a written test and there's a skills test. Those tests are held twice a year. So in the first half of the year, you register in March, you take the test in May, and you take the practical test in July. So I just finished taking the practical test last week, and then if I passed, then I can apply to the prefecture to get an actual license. If I fail, I still have a chance to apply in August. I can skip the written test because I already passed that, and then I can do the practical test in December. To apply to take the test, you need to sign up online. It's shiken.or.jp. You get an account, and then during the period when you can apply for the test, so either March or August, you apply to take the test, and they will send you a postcard with the time and location of the test. So in terms of costs, it costs about $200. That's including these textbooks you can buy, the application fee for the test, some of the tools and materials you need to practice. It's a pretty low bar to get a pretty helpful qualification. I'll talk first about the written test and how I prepared for it and show my actual test, and then I'll talk about the practical test and how that went and any kind of tips that would be helpful for someone doing this. In terms of my background, in terms of Japanese ability, I passed the N2, but only barely. I barely passed the N2. In terms of Japanese ability, if you can pass the N3, then I think you would be okay taking this test. There'll be a bunch of special words you need to learn that have to do with electricity, like insulation and conductor and resistance, that sort of thing. But because the types of words that will be in the questions is pretty limited, that I don't think anyone will have a hard time with the majority of the questions. In terms of what you need to know about electricity, I have a degree in electrical engineering, so a lot of things to do with circuit theory I've worked on for a long time and are pretty easy for me. That being said, I mostly worked on like circuit board design and wrote firmware. Whereas things you do as an electrician are usually involving bigger things like motors and lighting circuits and that sort of stuff. So what you need to know in terms of circuit theory and things with electricity, it's basically things you learn in high school. If you did anything like V equals IR, that's basically all you need to know. The only thing that kind of falls outside of what you might have learned in high school would be three-phase power, which is probably confusing if you've never had to like think about it before, but if you look it up or just remember some of the formulas that you need to use for it, it's not that confusing, it's not that tricky. There are a few different books available on Amazon. This is the one that I got. It's about 20 bucks. And I would heavily recommend getting a book to study from. It's going to include a lot of sample problems, and that's really helpful because the types of questions that are asked are going to be basically the same as the sample problem. So you should have seen everything that's on the test before you read it. The things you need to know and things that this book covers are pretty straightforward. I'll just go through it quickly. Symbols that are used in diagrams, the tools and materials that are used for construction. It also covers design of circuits. It also covers types of electrical construction. So like you could be using like metal pipe or plastic pipe or going underground, so on and so forth. It also covers design of electrical circuits. So for example, what size wire to use for a certain circuit, or what size breaker to use, or how you use size breakers and wiring for motor circuits. Now, if you're just renovating your house, you probably don't have a whole lot of motors you need to worry about, so it's something you don't necessarily need to know for your own house, but it's something you need to know as an electrician in general. That's why it's on the test. There's also a chapter on methods of testing your work. Basically, this revolves around checking that your ground actually is low enough resistance with a specific testing tool, and checking things like insulation resistance between lines, so on and so forth. One thing I found kind of interesting is there doesn't seem to be an actual outside inspection of your work by anybody. Once you're licensed, you can do renovation work and no one actually ever checks if it's right or not. So that's kind of interesting. On laws related to electrical work, mostly that revolves around electrical products. So things like outlets have to have a PSC mark on them, and then there's a PSC with square brackets and one with parenthesis, and that mean different things. Other parts of the law have to do with having a license and having it on yourself when you're working, and when you renew it or do a name change or so on and so forth, that kind of thing. It's a whole chapter to do with taking a normal wiring diagram and drawing it as they call it like a complex diagram, where each wire is individually drawn. Usually you just draw cables, and then how they're actually connected is kind of inferred, implied, whatever. Last but not least, the last chapter in this book is on electrical theory. So that covers V equals IR. Things you wouldn't know about from high school would be the lead lag between voltage and current in inductors and capacitors, and power factor when you have a motor load, and three-phase. And that sort of stuff's covered in the last chapter. And then the very last chapter of the book is just the practice problems. So if I was someone doing this, I would buy this book, and instead of sitting through it in detail, I would just use Google Translate Camera, quickly go through every page, get a sense of what's in here, and then make notes of things you don't understand at all, and then get into the practice problems as fast as you can, because that's where you're getting a sense of what kind of problems they actually ask you. A lot of the problems they ask you will have like little tricks that maybe aren't obvious, but if you do them in the practice problems, then you'll know how they work, and then you're going to see those on the test. They'll be the same, and you'll already be prepared for how you need to answer it. The book's $20. It's totally worth it. It's going to prepare you for the test perfectly, and the tests don't change that much year to year. So even if you got a bit of an older one, that'd be fine. Okay, so this is my actual test. You're allowed to bring it home with you for some reason. And this is what they'll give you when you go to write it. So I wrote mine on paper. You can also, there's also an option to write it CBT, computer-based testing, on a computer somewhere, but I thought it'd be fun to write it with everybody else, so that's what I did. And it's all multiple choice out of 4 options. So there's 50 problems on the test, they're each worth 2 marks, and you need 60% to pass. So things like come up with equivalent resistance for a circuit. There's how the area and length of a conductor affects its resistance. There's things to do with power times time is energy. There's questions to do with 200 volt 3-wire systems that are single phase, and when you have the neutral there, and if the loads are equal, then there's no return current on the neutral. There's questions about breaker sizing and typical, say a typical 20 amp circuit, how you size the wire and how you size the breaker. And a lot of the questions, if you're not really great at reading kanji, most of the questions have to do with what's the correct answer, which one of these is incorrect. So you only need to kind of know a few different phrases and kanji and words that you can recognize. So it's not really that hard. There'll be questions about recognizing pieces of equipment, so the picture of the equipment, and then say, what is this, A, B, C, D. And things related to types of construction where you say you're not supposed to use metal pipe on a wooden structure, that kind of thing. And then, so the first 30 questions are about that. And the last 20 questions are all based on one wiring diagram. And it'll be like a shop or a house, something simple like that. And then so all the last 20 questions are all just about this diagram, about what the different symbols means, which symbols aren't present in it, and then how you'd wire certain things. So showing, for example, there's for a light switch, there could be a pilot light that's always on or turns on and off with the switch, or is there to indicate where the switch is in the dark so you can see it. So how you'd wire those, which one of those is right out of the 4. And there's like questions like how many quick blocks do you need to do a certain junction, or how many ring sleeves do you need to use a certain junction, and or what tools you would need, and so on and so forth. So it's pretty easy, I would say. But you do need to prepare for it. And when I wrote it, I think I finished with about half an hour to go, so I had quite a bit of time to go through and check my answers without having to rush. And the whole time for the test is 2 hours. So it's pretty generous in terms of time. So if you pass the written test, then about 2 months later, you can take the practical test. And the way the practical test works is there's 13 different problems that are announced, and there'll be wiring diagrams for each one of them. And then from those 13 problems, you'll be presented with one of them. Everyone in the classroom gets the same problem, and you have to build that circuit in 40 minutes. And 40 minutes might seem like a long time, but it is not. You have to move pretty fast. I finished on time with about 2 minutes to spare, and I was going as fast as I could go. So let's talk about the practical test. I bought this book to study for the practical test, but I don't think it's really necessary. It's helpful for sure, but because the 13 problems are announced ahead of time, and they actually don't change year to year, you can just go on the shiken.or.jp website and download past candidate problems and their solutions. And so I looked at the past few years, and the candidate ones are always the same. So, and the solutions are there too, so those solutions really cover everything you need to know. So the practical test is pass-fail, and if you have any defects at all, you will fail. So defects are things like the wrong wires attached to the wrong place, you use the wrong size crimp, there's not, the wire looks, things that are pretty common sense. I don't necessarily recommend buying this, but you can if you want to. It's only $20, doesn't make that big a difference. So when the candidate problems are announced, they show the circuit, but they don't have any dimensions, any notes that might describe things you need to know to actually build it. That information is actually included on the exam itself when you write the test. So what I would recommend is buying some materials to practice with. You can buy like full sets of materials on Amazon, but it's expensive, and I don't think you really need to build every single circuit to get a sense of how you build them. I think it's good enough to try and build the lamp receptacle, an exposed outlet, a ceiling, practice putting enough wires in an outlet, And then they'll use a block like this to replace a motor or a timing switch or something like that. So you can practice with these things, practice using these guys and doing them right so the little wire shows and the insulation isn't missing or whatever. And then practice using ring sleeves. I actually never used ring sleeves before I did the test. I practiced on one piece of wire and said, okay, this is how it goes. I didn't use any ring sleeves when I was wiring the house. I just used these quick blocks. Materials you need to practice for the test, I'd get a metal box and a threadless box connector and the bushing. I get a plastic box and the PFCD box connector and some little switches. They also have a little metal frame. I get the metal frame so you can practice putting these switches inside there. In terms of the tools you'll need, this is actually a useful tool. It's a wire stripper that has parts for stripping cables, for either 3 or 2 conductors for 1.6 and 2 millimeter wire, and then it has a spot up here for doing stripping the actual wires. It also has a little kind of plier feature up here that's super helpful. When you're doing this, the way the book shows you how to do it is to strip off a big chunk of wire, bend it, and bend it again using pliers. I just use these and then twist it with this. It works pretty well. And then you don't need to change tools, and you don't need to buy pliers that you don't need for something else. You need to buy this tool to do the test because you have to do crimps on the test. And I don't use this for anything else. I just use it for passing the test. I'll probably never use it again. So it's kind of a waste of money, but it is what it is. In case you need to strip a cable that isn't a VVF, a flat cable, then you need to use one of these dinky knives. It's kind of a fairly fat knife that makes it easier to cut the insulation off the cable. I think you could just as easily use a box cutter, which you already have, so I don't think I'll ever use this again. I bought it just in case. You can strip a round cable with a box cutter. It's just harder. And then you probably also already have a Phillips and flathead screwdriver. You'll need those for doing the screws here, or when there's the frame where you need to squish in one of these guys. You need that for this. Or you need this for that. This is a recommended tool for the test. I didn't use it at all. The only situation where you need this is for this connector here. The screw here has to be sheared off, and I think it's easier to do it with this than it is to do it with a screwdriver. So that's the only reason I got that. And that's it. This is about 20 bucks, that's 40 bucks. And this is about 50 bucks. So that's about $90. This is the test they give you for the practical test. So the practical test itself is only 40 minutes, but there's about another 40 minutes of sitting around, and they'll give you a kit with all your materials in it, and then they'll give you 10 minutes to go through and check that all the materials that are on the test are in the kit. So when they give you the test, you can see that it's like this, and then when you open it, the circuit's right there. So when you get it, you can see through here 3 light switches. Well, I'm pretty sure that's the 4-way switch question. So you'll have an idea of what the problem is before you even open the booklet. So in my case, the question they gave us was the 4-way switch problem. So it's a switch that you can turn on and off from 3 different places. And then they give you dimensions between the center of each outlet or light receptacle and the box. And they'll say that one of the junctions should be using either quick blocks, or it should be using ring sleeves. And then one of them will be ring sleeves, one of them will be push quick blocks. The way the book describes to build stuff is to take the distance that's specified and then add 100 millimeters for the junction box and add 50 for the fixture. And then measure and cut, measure and cut. I think it's way faster and less stressful to strip off what you need to strip off. Don't really measure your cable stripping, and then do measure how much you strip off for, say, screws or for an outlet. And then do this part first with the wire still full length, and then with your scale that you already wrote down on the mat, just do this. Is that about 150? Cool. Cut it, put it in, strip it off, have it ready to go. And that way you're not, precisely measuring all these wires. I think it's a lot faster just to keep going, because you don't have time to switch between tools. It's going to slow you down. So I just eyeball the dimensions for the most part, because you can tell, is this going to be around 15 centimeters? Well, that's not very far off. And the rule for how your accurate dimensions have to be is it can't be less than half the dimension. So that's pretty loose. Anyways, yeah, so I'd do each thing that goes into the box first, then put them all into the box, do your connections at the very end. In this example, there was an outlet box. And when you get it, all the holes here are already pre-knocked out. So you don't need to knock anything out, but you do need to put in the rubber gums, that the bushings here. For example, in the question where they have a bunch of relays, then your relays will be replaced by a block like this, and they'll give you a simplified diagram that represents what this actually is. So all the information you need to build this is on the test. It's not terribly difficult, but you don't have time to draw a equivalent diagram showing each wire. I don't think you have time really to measure things that much. I would just start cranking through it as fast as you can, so you have time to check your work at the end. And then in the box of materials, they also give you a plastic bag to use for little scraps, and they also give you a name tag. So you need to write your name and the your exam number on that, and affix that to your work. And you do that after the bell goes. So they'll say, okay, stop, hands up, and then you can attach that at some point. So that's the practical test. Yeah, I'd say it is pretty fast. So be prepared to work quickly. It's a lot faster to strip something once than it is to try and strip it again. It's like double your work. So I would not worry so much about stripping the cable sheathing off. I just do that, eyeball it. But then when you go to install something into, say, a ceiling, use the gauge, or into here, know that you need to strip off 15 millimeters of insulation so you can turn your little loops nicely, or how much you should pull off for here. And all these, most of the fixtures have written on the gauge how many millimeters you need to pull off, so you can always check for most things. And if not, just cut it long, trim it, put it in. I think the Japanese electrician's test is really a great way to feel confident and legally wire your home, especially if you're doing a renovation. So if you're someone who's thinking about buying a Minka and doing a renovation, or buying just a normal old house and doing a renovation in the future, then I would just go ahead and just do this. The cost is pretty minimal. There's some time, but these are pretty helpful skills. And the barrier to get in there is really low, so I would just go for it. If anyone has a question about taking the Denki Kojishi test, please leave a comment below and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching.